Decided to take a different route to work today. We're lucky enough to live reasonably close to the ocean, so I grabbed my paddleboard this morning, walked a few blocks down the street to the park, and started paddling here along the shoreline towards the University of British Columbia, which is on a point in the west side of Vancouver. Luckily, I have an inflatable paddleboard, so at the end of the day, I will deflate it, put it in a bag, and take it home on the bus. But this is a perfect time to talk about the oceans and climate change. And so often when we think about climate, we think atmosphere, right? That's where we breathe, that's where we live, that's what we experience most of the time. But actually, the vast majority of all of that extra heat that's being trapped in the Earth's system due to adding greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that heat is going into the ocean. 93% of it is going into the ocean. The atmosphere's warming is actually just the tip of the iceberg. And we can measure this warming. There's clear data on the increase in the total amount of heat in the ocean. We see the change in surface temperatures, and we see the effect it's having on organisms around the planet, whether it's tropical corals, bleaching as a result of more extreme water temperatures, or whether it's kelp, seagrasses, and other organisms at our latitude that also can be affected by increase in ocean heat. But the other thing that heat does is this causing sea level rise. When water is warmed, it expands. And so most of the sea level rise to date is actually due to that thermal expansion. Going forward into the future, the big concern is how much additional water is going to be added to the ocean from Greenland and Antarctica. We already see the melting of ice and the major ice sheets accelerating. And so the concern is that the current rate of sea level rise could really accelerate going forward into the future. And so there's two things to really think about with sea level rise. The first is stop worrying about the mean. We always hear about what the average sea level is. But just like when we think about temperatures, we worry not so much about the average, but about the extremes. And so as sea level goes up, we are going to get more frequent extremes, more frequent high water levels. Just like we do as temperature goes up, we get more frequent heat waves. So that's one thing to consider. And what it means is that if your land is 1 meter above the ocean, it doesn't take 1 meter of sea level rise to do damage, because a lot less sea level rise than that, combined with a storm surge, combined with a high tide, can lead to extreme water levels. And those extremes leave a legacy. The legacy may be damage to homes, and maybe damages to infrastructure, could be loss of life. It also leaves a legacy in the soil, because every time ocean water floods onto land, it leaves some salt behind. And that salt water penetrates the ground, infects the groundwater or aquifers. And it's that is actually the really big threat to so many places, right? So even with just moderate amounts of sea level rise, you can see damage to agriculture. You can see vegetation struggling because the water it accesses in the ground is too salty. So it doesn't take a lot of sea level rise to see an effect. So that was the first thing, think about the extremes. The second one is think about the time scale of decision making. So right now, sea level is only going up about 3.5 millimeters per year. That doesn't sound like much. That rate may go up 5 times by the end of the century. And so if you're making a decision now, you have to think of the legacy of those decisions. Say you're lucky enough to have the money to afford one of the many expensive coastal homes I just paddled by. Well, if you got a 25-year mortgage on that home, by the end of that 25 years, the odds of flooding at a high tide are a little bit higher. And if you go forward another 25 years, 50 years from now, the odds are even higher. So say you're making a decision to purchase that home now. By the end of your mortgage, when you're hoping that home has a lot of value, in order to resell it, use the money for retirement, etc., you could be in a bit of trouble. Because the people buying that home are going to be thinking 25 years ahead of them, right? And so actually, if you back calculate and think it all through, sea level change 50 years from now could affect purchasing decisions today. And so we see things like this all over our coastal cities and communities where we have infrastructure that we want to have a long lifetime, that we want to have value in the future. And sometimes it's not actual physical infrastructure, maybe it's cultural infrastructure, a park that matters to people, right? Or a fishing ground that has been important to a community for generations, right? The sea level, we want to make sure we can preserve these things into the future, which means the rate, what the sea level is going to be 50, 100 years from now sometimes really matters, right? And so we can still do a lot to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avoid the most dangerous, high projections of sea level rise that have been made for the end of the century and beyond. And those decisions we make today are going to affect the sea level for generations to come. If we pass 2 degrees of warming, for example, we may trigger a number of the processes that can lead to the melting of much of the Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets. Right? It doesn't mean that'll happen at 2 degrees of warming, but 2 degrees of warming may be enough to trigger them to happen. So we need to make the decisions now, both about reducing emissions and about how we're going to adapt our coastlines and our coastal communities if we want to have a safer future. All right, short break, up we go.